BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive.
Paule Vézelay was born in Bristol in 1892. 75 years ago, she decided that she'd become a serious painter, and she's worked virtually every day ever since, and still does, despite increasing frailty, deafness, and arthritis. Some French art historians have recognized her contribution to the development of modern art, but in her native land, Paule Vézelay is still relatively unknown. She's had only 4 exhibitions in England since the war. In 1983, her work was shown in a retrospective at the Tate that showed how Paule Vézelay gradually abandoned representational work in the late 1920s and committed herself totally and irrevocably to the abstract movement. Benedict Nicholson, who's usually thought of as the first British abstract painter, had barely begun to experiment with abstraction at the time. Paule Vézelay spends her time on developing the work rather than promoting herself or competing for public attention. Her intense fastidiousness has kept her out of the marketplace and the public eye altogether. Her work is her life, and she keeps it about her as the living oyster keeps its pearl. The arbiters of contemporary British taste knew nothing about her. Some of the many words they used to praise Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth could have been spent on her. Her chosen isolation makes it difficult to talk of influence, but Paule Vézelay was the most modern, the least provincial British artist of her time. Paule Vézelay lives in London. She has never married. She changed her name in homage to the Romanesque church of Vezelay and in order to identify herself with the École de Paris. She was born Margery Watson-Williams. When you were exhibiting in England, you usually exhibited as M. Watson-Williams, didn't you? Did you do this on purpose?
It was my family name.
But you only used the initial mostly, and when you wrote, you signed M. Watson-Williams. And sometimes in the pieces that you wrote, you refer to yourself as if you were a man.
I don't think so.
I've
never pretended to be a man. Never.
But
it certainly would have been easier for me as an artist if I had been a man. It would have been much easier.
You were exhibiting as M. Watson-Williams, and then you changed your name.
Yes, I did.
To Paule Vézelay.
Yes.
And if somebody hears that spoken, it sounds like a masculine name. And you generally signed P. Vezelay, didn't you?
Yes.
Was this because you didn't want the question of your sex to come into it at all?
I don't see why it should, but I didn't do it deliberately to avoid the question of sex. I put Paul with an E on the end, which was a hint that it was feminine Paul. But all that's not important to my mind. What is important is the work. Is it original? Is it well done? Is it good? That's what matters.
Margery Watson-Williams went to a private school. She distinguished herself there. She played hockey and was good at art. Even then, she knew exactly what she wanted to do.
I always wanted to draw, and later on I wanted to paint, of course.
And then you went to the Slade and left almost immediately.
Yes. I'd already studied in art schools for 2 solid years, and I didn't want to be treated as a beginner at the Slade. And they were very old-fashioned, I thought. They expected you to measure up how many times a man's head went into his body, and all this nonsense. And I was bored to death. So I asked my father if I could leave and go study under George Belcher, who was then quite unknown young artist. He hadn't even got onto the staff of Punch, but I saw his drawings reproduced, and they were sensitive and, to my mind, excellent. and I wanted to be his student.
But already at this time, when you're still so young, you're very independent, making an independent judgment.
I wasn't all that young. I was about 17 or 18.
That strikes me as very young.
It does now. I'm old, but it didn't then, you know.
Belcher encouraged her to draw from the life that was going on around her, rather than from studio models. But even then, hers was not simply an interest in recording events of everyday life. Her real concern was with the rhythm of line and mass. She produced distinctive work in which the influence of Aubrey Beardsley is rather apparent. Then the Great War closed the art schools as her fellow men students went to war.
But I belong to the generation, all the young men I'd ever known, danced with, they were all killed in the First World War. A generation of young men was wiped right out of my life. All the students I'd met at the art school, they all joined up.
Do you think that if that hadn't happened, you would have had a conflict at some point?
I expect I should.
Are you glad you escaped that conflict?
I'm not glad about anything. I think it's very nice if you love a man to marry and have babies. Very nice for a woman. Most women want babies. There was a time when I would love to have had a baby to cuddle. I had opportunities to marry, but it was what my nurse used to call Mr. Right Man. I wasn't in love with several people who wanted to marry me, and I didn't want to marry without that element.
In 1918, when the war was ending, she held several exhibitions in London. Did you get encouragement?
One or two people encouraged me, but otherwise, no.
What about your parents?
My father did. He was quite a good draftsman himself. He was a doctor, a specialist, nose, throat and ear specialist. But he drew quite well, and he used to go fishing, and if the fish didn't rise, he would take out his sketchbook and draw the trees or something like that.
And he was proud of you, was he?
Well, I hadn't done anything to make him proud of me, but he wanted to be. He did encourage me.
Not so her mother, who wanted her attractive daughter to be done with art schools and come home to Bristol. Instead, in 1921, Paule Vézelay went to Paris. She was completely bowled over by what she saw in the Paris galleries. Her father gave her a small allowance.
I was very hard up in Paris, but I learned a tremendous lot. It was the period of Braque and Picasso and various other important people in modern art, which were almost unknown in England at that time.
So do you think that when you were 17, 18 going to art school, that you were already looking for something different from the English provincial type?
Not consciously, I wasn't, but English art then bored me almost to tears. There wasn't anything outstanding to my mind at that time in England.
What was wrong with it, do you think?
I don't know. Lack of encouragement, probably, for original work. English don't like originality very much in art, you know.
She was already 34 when she made the decision to leave Britain and work in Paris. Paris filled her with excitement. She wrote,
"Below my open window lies Paris. Paris, who draws to her side at one time or another every artist of the world. What man who ever spoiled clean canvas can escape the allure, and who among them all can explain her fascination? Outside Paris, it is hardly an exaggeration to say that modern art is treated more hardly than the illegitimate child. In Paris, by people who should know of these things, it is regarded as likely, if wedded with sincerity, to give birth to everything of value in the art of the future."
The stylization she had always favoured became more and more extreme. At first like Picasso's in the Pink period, and then almost expressionist, and then Matisse-like. More and more she felt herself free to approach in her paintings the qualities of music and the dance. She withdrew more and more to follow the inexorable progress of her own work. In 1926, she took the plunge and executed her first abstract drawing.
You've got to do a lot of thinking before you invent something which is rather new.
Were you aware that you were looking for your own visual language?
No, I think I wasn't aware. It just happened that way.
But it's very difficult to say that you must go on looking for something when you don't know what it is.
Things happen in art, I think. You don't want them to happen, you don't look for them, but they do happen.
What sort of things?
Well, art develops. The more you think about it, the more it changes.
But then once you develop those shapes, they become unmistakably yours. No one else uses shape the way you do.
You've got to work hard at art to be an artist. It takes a long time to control your hand and make your hand obey everything you want in a line. A line's very extraordinary. It can be dark or light or curved or straight. It can be a lively line, it can be a dull line, but you've got to be able to control it with your hand. And that takes years of practice, I think.
Does that mean that when you sit in front of a canvas and you're going to draw your line, that the line must be right?
Yes.
Before you draw it?
It must be exactly as you want it, so that you can draw it exactly as you intend it to be. And that takes some doing. You can draw a line on paper in 2 dimensions, but it's more interesting if you put it into space.
But does it float in the space, or does it advance and recede in the space? What is its relation to the space?
Well, I made use of wires, you see, and of course I could curve them. And first of all I used straight lines.
But you are supposed to be among the first, or perhaps the first person, to suspend these lines.
Yes, I think I was the first.
Paule Vézelay's manipulation of pure line is now seen as an important innovation in the development of modern art.
But that was too limited, so I used plastic wires that I could curve and fix at one end in little boxes. They were lines in space.
But your interest in curves is one of the things that distinguishes you from many other abstract artists, so-called, and from the constructivists in particular.
Yes.
What attracted you so much about curves?
They exist in nature, and they exist in life. And why limit yourself to straight lines and angles?
Well, you see, what the straight line people might say is that they love straight lines because they don't exist in nature.
Well, they're welcome to their own ideas, but why limit yourself when you can have curves and straight lines?
In the 30s, Paule Vézelay was exhibiting in Paris, Holland and Italy. She was recognized among her peers and respected by them. Giacometti, the Arps, Miro, all came to see her work. Ernest Hemingway bought a painting. It is now assumed that she was a minor artist, merely imitating painters like Miro.
I admired his work, but I don't think he had any real influence on me, because I was already formed, you know, in my own work, in my own style, before I knew his work.
Well, we have found his name, you know, in one of the visiting books of the Boucher Gallery. He came to see your work.
Yes.
And it seems rather likely that, in fact, it goes the other way round, that he was influenced by you.
I don't know. You see, a lot of interesting people came to that gallery, Boucher.
Yes.
She had a great following because she was always showing young artists she thought were interesting. And the better-known artists came, which was rather an honour for them. She gave quite a few exhibitions of my work, and she always made me welcome when I went there.
One of the artists her name is constantly associated with is the French surrealist painter André Masson. People who have done research into the late 20s and the 30s in Paris
have persistently told us that your name is to be linked with the name of André Masson. They even told us that you were known as Madame Masson at one stage in Paris.
I never called myself Madame Masson. We were engaged to be married, and we went, both of us together, to make a declaration of intention to marry. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I had reason to change my mind. And I changed it, which was very painful. I was very fond of him at one time.
Another artist with whom her name is often linked is the sculptor Jeanne Arp.
Was Arp supportive of you?
Yes, he did. He liked my work, and I liked his work, and his wife's work was splendid, I think. They became, both of them, very friendly with me.
And did you find that the contact with the Alps was exciting, was fruitful for you?
It was pleasant. I met him at a little gathering, and somebody, the host, said, "Who knows Arp's work?" Arp, of course, years and years ago, Arp was almost unknown. I said, "I do, teacher." Like this, you know. And he said, "Oh, that's very nice. Come and meet my wife and have lunch with us." He lived at Meudon. And that was the beginning of a very good friendship with them both.
Paule Vézelay went on several holidays in the south of France with Jeanne Arp and his wife Sophie Teuber Arp. Back in Paris in the mid-30s, under Jeanne Arp's influence, she began creating sculpture, which in turn influenced him.
It's been said by someone that you influenced Arp as well as Arp influencing you.
I think I did, a little bit.
Perhaps the most important group that you belonged to was Abstraction Création.
Yes, that was a good group. Of course, it contained a good many interesting artists. That was the reason. And they had a great struggle, abstraction, creation. They had the same struggle as the Impressionists. They couldn't find a dealer who would give them a show.
Was it a help to you to be identified with that group?
I don't know if it was a help, or I perhaps helped them, mutual sort of help. But it was interesting to meet other people with more or less the same ideas about art, although we didn't discuss it much.
You didn't discuss it?
No, we didn't.
To a layman, you would think that the group was the thing that helped you to define what you were doing.
Well, our work was supposed to do that, you see.
Well, then why do artists, and in particular abstract artists, keep forming these groups with different names and different magazines and different manifestos?
Because it's interesting to see what other artists are doing. And after all, you draw and paint because you can't put into words what you want to say.
So do you think that you communicated with each other without words?
Yes, I think up to some extent we did that. Because words are easy to write, not easy to choose, but easy to write. And to draw a line is very difficult. It takes years before you can draw the exact line you want in the exact way, in the exact place that you want it to be. With its modulations of tone and curves and so on. It's not all that easy.
The distinguished British landscape painter Paul Nash was a contemporary and friend. He wrote the introduction to the catalogue of one of her exhibitions.
I want to read you a quotation from Paul Nash. He says, "To my mind, Paule Vézelay's talent is unmistakably genuine. For that reason, it has an especial value, a peculiar charm. It is unnecessary to point out, of course, that it is altogether lacking in that intractable efficiency of the mannish female artist, or the brutal technique of the male impersonator. Now, I find that rather difficult to take from Paul Nash. That remark worries me, that in order to praise Paule Vézelay, he has to say nasty things about unnamed women artists.
He doesn't name them, though.
And thank goodness. In the 30s, you went through a period of enormous creativity. You were doing a lot of work, which was highly respected. You were a member of the group Abstraction Création. And then what happened?
Nothing that I was responsible for.
The war, I suppose.
The war.
Did the war change everything?
More or less. I lost a lot of work. I had to leave France or be interned, which I shouldn't have liked at all. And the thing was to get out of France, because the Germans were advancing rapidly. To get out of France while I could.
And then you came back to England.
Yes.
And you found it very difficult to work.
Yes, I did. I lived with my parents. My mother wasn't at all interested in art. My father was. But I had to look after both of them as well as I could, various periods. It wasn't at all an easy time for me.
So you came up against the old female problem, that the family is your responsibility.
Well, it was a female problem, exactly. I was an affectionate daughter, and I tried to help them both, and they helped me. It was a very difficult period for everybody in England, really. These terrible air raids.
Paule Vézelay's parents were still living in Bristol, which took a heavy pounding from German bombers. She could no longer concentrate on the refinement of her inner vision, but went out into the shattered streets and drew the images of devastation. She was never named an official war artist, but she asked for and got permission to draw the Barrage Balloon Centre in Bristol.
It was manned, so to speak, by women, the balloon section.
The barrage balloons?
Yes, barrage balloons. I went out there and made drawings of the barrage balloons and talked to the women. And one man was officer there. He was almost in tears. He said, "We've had gale warnings, and no gale has come. And yesterday I had a gale warning, and I ignored it, and it came. The gale came, and I lost a balloon." Of course, they were very valuable to see, these balloons.
They were made of silk, were they? What were they made of?
I don't know what they were made of, but the women had to hold them down when they were being inflated, and then just at the right moment let them go up. And one silly girl, she didn't let go quick enough. She got carried up.
That happened to somebody last week here in England. A professional balloonist got carried up.
Oh, yes.
Silly fellow.
But fortunately, she had the wit or the panic to let go pretty quickly, as you can imagine. And she fell onto some concrete, and she wasn't hurt much, fortunately.
Now, you have a drawing upstairs, a pastel of a barrage balloon.
Yes, I have, and I've got two nice drawings of these girls in the balloon, what they call the balloon shed, when they were taken down, you see.
What did you like about the balloons?
I liked, they rather fascinated me because they were balloons. They were up in the air, tossing about.
They were form without volume. Or...
Yes, they rather fascinated me, and they were quite useful.
And when they were being inflated, your drawing shows it like some great...
Yes, a monster coming to life. It was extraordinary.
And that shape, it seems to me that shape, the balloon shape for you, ties in with the shapes that you loved to manipulate on the canvas.
Up to a point, yes. Yes, they did.
Because it seems to me always in your work, or nearly always, the ground against which the shapes float is resonant. The shapes seem to be capable of moving forwards and back. It's not flat, the space. It's full of caverns.
I hope it's full of air. I think a painting wants to be, or drawing wants to have air indicated. I think a great many artists cram all kinds of forms and lines into their paintings, which would be much better with half the number.
Do you think that after the war you were able to pick up where you left off?
No, I wasn't able. I went back to Paris. There was nothing I could afford. A tiny studio, the size of this room, with £7,000. I hadn't got that money. So I didn't want to work in a hotel bedroom, which is absolutely impossible. I did go back for some time, and the Boucherie Gallery, Madame Boucherie, she was a friend of mine, and she let me sleep there in a room packed with masterpieces by Picasso and Braque and goodness knows who, all stacked up against the wall, and I was allowed to sleep underneath this little sort of dressing room.
Paule Vézelay was more than 50 years old. Her creative life in Paris was a thing of the past. She had no choice but to struggle to pick up the threads of her artistic development in the alien atmosphere of post-war Britain. Abstraction was not widely understood in Britain, and Vezelay had played no part in the development of the militant modernist movement.
You said to me before, and I was really fascinated by it, that really abstraction is impossible.
It's ridiculous to talk about abstract art, but the idea is, I think, that you abstract from objects what you find pleasing in their form and lines and so on, and you abstract that.
You also talked about a language which spoke directly to the emotions in your painting, that instead of having to tell yourself a story, you look at a picture and say, this is this and that is that, and I recognize them, that the language of the painting is the pure language of emotion. I found it very interesting because one of the things I find in your painting is an emotion that I would have to call joy.
I'm glad you said that, because I dislike sad art. There's enough real sadness in real life. I think an artist might create something joyful or happy or pleasing, as they used to do, after all. They used to paint beautiful nude women, which gave certain people great pleasure. Now, if they paint a nude, it looks like somebody who's been under a tram car for about 10 minutes, you know. Nothing's left.
I wrote a book once about women painters, and I said one of the worst things that could happen to you if you were a young woman working very well in a class under a painter who impressed you, one of the worst things that could happen was that he would fall in love with you. It was understood that you would be in love with him if you're 17 years old and he's your teacher and you think he's wonderful. And you were safe as long as he didn't fall in love with you and marry you, because then you were more or less sunk.
Yes, quite sunk. I don't think you could make rules about what is the right sort of husband. If you're very much in love with a man who loves you, I don't think it matters all that much whether he's a painter or a plumber.
But what about your work?
Ah, yes, but you don't think of that in advance. Most married women, it fades out. They haven't the time and the energy to go on with their work seriously. And I think it's a great mistake for a woman to marry if she wants to be an artist.
Paule Vézelay was a significant figure in Paris during one of the most vital periods in the development of European art. She herself is unself-conscious about the fact that she's a woman. Nevertheless, many of the factors which limited her freedom to live and work as she wished were inevitable concomitants of her femaleness.
I wanted to ask you about some of the wives, women artists, whom you would have known or heard of, or whose work you would have seen in Paris. Obviously, the one you were closest to was Sophie Teuber-Arp.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always wondered, do you think she would have been a greater artist if she hadn't been married to Arp? And if she'd worked the way you have?
She would have had much more recognition if she hadn't been married to Arp. Arp was good company. He was very gifted. People came to see Arp. They didn't come to see her, but she was very gifted and very modest and very nice Swiss woman, very gentille. She said, how can I be an artist with one hand in the kitchen and one hand in the studio? Like most wives, she was expected to make beds and serve meals and cook and housekeep. It's most unfair, really.
Sophie Teuber-Arp died in a car accident in 1941. Some people expected Paule Vézelay to marry Arp. Instead, their spiritual and intellectual collaboration was carried on across the Channel. They have exchanged prints, sculptures, poems throughout their long lives. In the 1950s, Paule Vézelay brought a new sophistication to British commercial textile design.
And somebody who produced textiles asked me would I design a textile for him, which I did with great pleasure. And then another firm, a Dutch firm, asked me to do some designs for them. And then in England, Heels asked me to design for them. And I enjoyed it very much. It's got to be decorative, it's got to be printable. And the design, if it's well done, when the curtains are drawn, it's lovely. It breaks up the design in a most interesting way.
Which period of your work have you enjoyed the most? Which kind of work?
That's very difficult. I've enjoyed each period, I think, and then worked through it into something else. Generally speaking, you paint a picture which is good or perhaps bad, but it leads on to something which you hope will be more complete.
And you never had anything like writer's block? You know, writers get to the stage where they can't write anything.
Oh yes, or quite often. And I start work at my easel, and I know it's bad, and I know it's quite bad, but I think it'll lead on to something better. So I go on, and I can always tear up the bad work I've done. It often does lead on to something more complete and better. Bad work can lead to good work. Like sketching, you know, you enrich a sketch and you change things in the composition perhaps. But I think bad work's quite important as long as you realize it's bad and let it lead you on to something better.
One of the most frightening things I've ever seen is what happens when a painter who was neglected is taken up, because the art market is so stupid that where it ignored good work for years and years, then suddenly every piece of paper that artist made a mark on is sold for £17,000.
Yes.
This has happened to Gwen John. In some ways she makes me think of you because she's a very concentrated, self-possessed painter. In her way, very arrogant.
Yes.
Not taking anybody else's judgment. I think you would enjoy the work. Perhaps we should make sure that you see
I
some.
don't think I'm arrogant.
Oh, you must be, mustn't you? It's important.
Arrogant isn't the word I would choose.
Proud.
Arrogant leaves a nasty taste in your mouth, I think. I don't feel arrogant at all about other painters, even the bad ones. And I know them to be bad. I don't feel at all arrogant.
Paule Vézelay still works almost every day. Nowadays, the line has receded in importance as she works on fields of hue and light and shade, still following confidently, doggedly, wherever the work should lead her.
I would like to very much have a qualification as master of the line or something of that sort, because I am a master of lines.
Would you like to be a dame, like Dame Laura Knight?
I would like to have any recognition. I don't particularly want to be a dame. I think it's a terrible thing to be created a dame. It's very stuffy and it's very, very Victorian. And it's quite out of date to my mind. But any sort of recognition is rather nice to have.
I don't know how it is that an artist decides upon a value for his work. And how do you decide that your painting is worth this or that amount of money? What criterion do you use?
I never tell you the truth. I never know what price I should put on my work. I just make a sort of guess what I think it's worth.
Do you have any idea what other people's work is worth?
More or less, yes. More or less.
We were told by one dealer that one of the problems with Paule Vézelay's work is that it's much too highly priced and no one will buy it.
I don't think that's true. They can't tell that they can't sell it till they try.
But you wouldn't advise anybody, for example, to lower prices in order to sell more?
Not unless they're very hungry, I wouldn't. I think an artist should put the prices he thinks the work is worth.
And insist on those prices?
Yes, I think so. Otherwise, however low your prices are, the people who want you to sell them for half the price, or two for the price of one, as they do in America. No, I think if painting's good, it's worth a good price.
What percentage of your work have you still got?
Oh, quite a lot of it.
Does that mean that you'd rather be with it than without it, or?
I would rather be with it than sell it very cheaply for the sake of selling it. Yes, I would. I like my work. Strange as it may seem, I like my paintings. I like to keep them. I'm never in a hurry to sell them.
It argues a great faith in yourself, that you've never been shaken.
I have a certain amount of faith in myself, confidence in myself.
Do you ever doubt? Do you ever think perhaps it's all been a mistake?
No.
Never.
I know some of the things are much better than the others, and I've probably painted my share of bad pictures. But I've worked seriously, and people whose opinion I value have liked my work very much and written about it. That gives me a certain amount of confidence.
Would you say that yours has been a happy life?
I don't know what you mean by happy.
Neither do I.
I did what I wanted to do. I wasn't obliged to go and work as a typist in an office, or as a saleswoman, or as a children's nurse. I've been very fortunate.
Has it satisfied you, the work? Has it?
Up to a point, yes.
And what lay beyond the point?
Well, it's very fascinating painting, because you learn as you go along. You're always making new discoveries and things.